Hello and welcome back to our consideration of the women of Troy. Today we're going to be covering Hecuba's Monody, that little monologue that comes straight after the prologue with the gods. And in doing so, we're going to think about three things. Firstly, what is the image of Hecuba coming in to this scene, and therefore how might we interpret her role in the play up to this point? Secondly, we're going to go line by line through this scene again, as we did last time, and consider the bits of evidence that you may choose to use in your essays, but also which may inform your view of this piece of literature in the abstract. Then, finally, we're going to cover what the role of Hecuba is in this play as a whole, and incorporate some critical perspectives from critics into it. So, let's first talk about Hecuba as a character coming into this. To the extent that you can nominate a main character to this play, I think that you choose Hecuba. And yet all of the characters in the play we know more about than her. In other words, we seem to not know very much about the main character that Euripides chooses for us, and perhaps that's the sense of tragedy that hangs about the Trojan Queen, that her suffering is unceasing, relentless, and simultaneously completely without support. The pain that she experiences throughout this play remains unanswered for. And so as we read this monody and analyze it, I want you to remember that first description of Hecuba that we get right before the prologue, of Hecuba lying face down and quite still, as Poseidon puts it, literally reduced to a kind of a creature. And when we think about that, we think about the dehumanization that befalls her as she sees her son Hector, the greatest Trojan warrior, die in battle fighting Achilles, as she sees her own husband sort of sprawled out on the steps of the temple for Zeus the Protector, this sort of cruel irony of fate. And that's what we're confronted with when we imagine Hecuba as a character. She has lost all, far more than any other character in this play, and yet, as we will see in this opening monody, is also far, far more powerful than any other character in this play. And there's something quite remarkable, therefore, about that. So, let's consider now this scene line by line. We begin with this image of Hecuba, now sort of presumably lifting herself slowly from the ground, as she gives these two opening imperatives, very powerful imperatives. Says, "Lift up your head from the dust. Heave up from the earth the weight of your misery, you whom the gods have cursed." We shouldn't forget the power of those commands. She's commanding the women, her daughters, as she would call them, to raise themselves literally, but also raise themselves, therefore, emotionally, out of the sort of distraught state that war has left them in, and to try and revive, incite, ignite some sense of hope. And that's particularly powerful when we pair that with the final lines that she has in the play, along with those of the chorus, where she says, "Old limbs strengthen," that same kind of an imperative, saying, hey, endure this pain, bear it, because there's something ahead. And similarly, in the final lines of the chorus, to march down to the Chian fleet, that's the command that the chorus gives. Also note here, then, the real sense of difficulty we get in heave. It's a really strong sense of the burden there, and it's heave up the weight of your misery. Misery, sadness, distraught in this play is literally rendered a kind of a weight, an emotional burden that has to be borne by these characters. And therefore the you in this sentence is even more tragic, because the sadness is that there is no one being addressed, not even the chorus is on stage at this point. And you get a real sense, therefore, of a queen ruling over, as she says, ruling over nothing. Her kingdom is gone, all her power is gone, her status is gone, there's nothing left for her here, if you like. You whom the gods have cursed, Troy has ceased to exist. We by birth, Troy's kings and queens, rule over nothing now. I want to note here what is vested in that word Troy. because clearly Troy exists. Troy is a smoking ruin right now. And here you see a really dichotomous understanding of what Troy is. You have Poseidon's Troy, the shining citadels, the famous Troy, the walls that he himself built, right? That's Troy to Poseidon. It's a physical entity. But clearly to Hecuba, Troy is not a physical entity. The Troy that she says has ceased to exist is the Troy that she rules over, is the human Troy, the Troy comprised of its citizens, comprised of her subjects, comprised of her husband, her son, her daughters. And that Troy has now ceased to exist. The humanity within it has been stripped bare. Uh, and so I think that's an interesting dichotomy to play with, that Hecuba seems to have a very different sense of what this city is, and also of what therefore she is, what she rules over, what her responsibilities as a leader of this Troy is, than what Poseidon does. And I think that's an important contrast to kind of tease out. The old life is gone, old gods, old hearth, home destroyed. Note there the sort of list of objects, these symbols of a life, the home, the life, the gods, the hearth, these sort of inner sanctum items, right, of a person's being are all, completely decimated. And also that sense, that asyndeton there, there's a lack of conjunctions. It really makes it quite jarring. A series of discordant images sort of tied together very, very loosely. And because of that, and because of the repeated old, 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 there's a sense of disconnect, I suppose, in the unity of the repetition and the disconnectedness of the lack of conjunction. And it builds to a sense of real disconcertion in this opening monody. We must endure it. That line to me encapsulates so much of what role Hecuba plays here. We must. Where is this imperative coming from? Who's ordering her to endure it? No one. Hecuba is, in some sense, has power and agency over herself, and yet she feels this kind of owing that she must endure it. Well, for whom? But also this sense of enduring. The defining role of Hecuba is that of a woman who is enduring the pain of war, who is enduring the suffering of war. She's the manifestation of war's cruelties because she must suffer from so many of them. And so we get this sort of defining characteristic of Hecuba almost immediately. Flow with the stream, let new wind fill our sail, not breast a running tide with our fragile prow. You get this very common in Greek theatre, a nautical metaphor for fate, right? And she says, "Let new wind fill our sail," as if she is some kind of a ship. But note two things there that I think add to the tragedy of this monody. The passivity, let new wind. As if, and whose wind is it? Well, it's the Greeks' wind, right? They get to choose what happens to these women now. And so, in that passivity, I think you get a real sense of what's lost. Agency is lost, freedom is lost, any sense of identity independent of their masters is lost. And that's the sort of tragedy that I think is carried in that line. But also equally, what she asks for there is tragic. She wants to flow the stream, to gently, not breast a running tide, to not challenge these sort of tides of the time, the tides of fate. And yet, we know what she gets, because we know what Poseidon prophesizes, right? Or what Poseidon promises. Mountainous waves, torrential rains, savage hail. That's what's coming for her. And so there's a real dramatic irony there that demands a kind of sympathy for Hecuba, because she doesn't know what's about to happen to her, and so she's sort of wishing for this far more ideal world than what will eventually amount. Also, I think, remember that image of a prow. and compare Hecuba describing the sort of fragile prow at the front of her ship to the bows of the Greek ships that are grounded in the Bay of Troy, a literal kind of assault, right, of the land that she calls home. And so that contrast also gives you a sense of the power dynamic here, that she is utterly powerless, unable to sort of be the captain of her own ship, to set her own course, and to, I guess, demand control over fate. Oh, weep, weep for my burning home, howl. Few things. Firstly, the enclosed word order there. Weep, weep, howl. The enclosed word order of imperatives, I think, really gives you a sense of the enfolding nature of this sadness. That these demands literally surround this home, surround what she actually wants. And it's inescapable in that kind of a line. Secondly, the sort of circular rhythm, weep, weep, the extended vowels. If you imagine this delivered on stage, I think you get a real sense of the sinking cadence, right? Weep, weep, for my burning home, howl. It's a command to express grief. Later on, she says, some agonies are beyond telling, and some must be told. It's the obligation to vocalize this suffering. And it's a meta-theatrical comment as much as it's a comment within the narrative, because it explains why it is that Euripides stages this play in the first place. That there's an obligation to weep, there's an imperative to weep, in order to show how horrific this, these horrors are. For my burning home, for my children dead, for my husband dead. The sort of literal cascade of images that we keep getting in this monody so far really shows you the extent of war's destruction, right? It's that asyndeton again. There's no conjunctions joining them. They're just discordant images, one after the other, literally. So you can sense the sort of, pounding rhythm that, to me, I think destroys any sense of hope that may remain in this play. Also that anaphora, for my, that these losses are not just political. These losses are not just, the loss of fame, the loss of riches. They are personal losses. She has lost a husband, has lost a son, has lost a home, has lost her status. And that's really sad. Also, the repetition of dead, my children dead, my husband dead. It's used in apposition, but you don't have to use that word. It's in effect, it's the adjective immediately following the noun without any sort of intervening verb there, right? It's not my husband is dead, it's my husband dead. The abruptness of that kind of the abruptness of that kind of image, and the insertion of that kind of adjective. The boast of my noble family, empty as a sail when the winds fall. The emptiness parallels the nothingness. We rule over nothing now. The harrowing lack of meaning that Hecuba is troubled by. And that, if anything, is the harsh or harshest punishment that's administered here. That, after all, there's a vacuousness in what can be achieved in life, and a real sense of emptiness there. Also note the noble family. This is what Hecuba values. She values her family. And that's complicated, as we'll later discuss when we get to Andromache and discussing that relationship with Hector. But compare that to Poseidon, the complete disregard for person and for love and for loved ones. There's a need to protect her family here. And it's a conventional portrayal, sure, but also a touching one. Some agonies are beyond telling, and some must be told. We get that imperative again, and I think it's really curious why we do. Because I think it's very central, because it explains the obligation to express pain, the obligation to vocalize it, the obligation to stage it, to watch it, to portray it, as Euripides sees it, at least. Let my stretched limbs shake with it then, this keening on my rack of pain. Let my limbs shake with it then. The body almost becomes a vehicle for expressing pain. It's another, to me, meta-theatrical comment about theatre. Because you have to imagine what scene the audience is looking at here. I'll try to put a picture up while editing this, but in case I don't, imagine sort of a stage covered in dust and Hecuba literally dressed in rags, sort of sitting or standing, either one really, on the ground, covered in dust, um, trembling in fear for what is to come, but also in the terror of what she's just experienced. And so when she says, let my stretched limbs shake with it then, the body becomes a vehicle for the expression of that kind of pain. The body becomes a vehicle for the expression of that kind of suffering. And it's powerful. And if you can make those theatrical comments, I think it does analysis a lot of good, because it shows an understanding of the women of Troy not just as a sort of text, right, like as in words on a page, but also as a performance, both in Taylor's time in 2007, I think, and in Euripides' time in 415 BC. So, this keening, a literal sort of vocal lament, on my rack of pain, my bed of cold stone, it's animalistic. This is an image of ritual animal sacrifice, right? And it's deeply disturbing. But that's what these women are. That's what all people in war are. It's what Talthybius is. It's what Hector is. It's what Ajax ultimately is. It's what Cassandra, what Andromache are. They are these animals that are being sacrificed in service of what? In service of a defense of a kind of heroism, of a kind of masculinity. We're told Menelaus flatters his masculinity, or of Agamemnon, I think, that he's shot through with lust. There's a real sense of violent undertone there, and that's what this sacrifice is too. And I think that's, again, important. And if you want to take the sacrifices to the gods, of course, that's a valid interpretation. But then don't forget, Euripides chooses the most Homeric of all the gods, the most conventionally powerful, not Zeus, but Poseidon, this sort of hyper-masculine figure. My temples are throbbing, my head will burst, my heart shatters the walled prison of my breast. This is such a powerful, visceral description of how she feels. The violent verbs there, throbbing, burst, shatters, but also the sort of, assault of plosives, temples, throbbing, burst, shatters, prison, breast. The sort of repeated consonants really sort of hits home at how violent these actions are. Also, don't forget the sort of caesura that finishes it. After this sort of violent string of actions, suddenly you switch to "oh sway, flow, lifted by the gentle rocking of a boat." The sudden change really emphasizes how violent, how destructive these feelings are. Don't forget also that there's a rhythmic thing happening here. My temples are throbbing, my head will burst, my heart shatters the walled prison of my breast. This is a repeated rhythmic effect that really gets at, I think, the sort of repetitive assault of war on the human mind, but also on the human body, I guess, right? And the repeated infliction of pain. Oh, sway, flow, lifted by the gentle rocking of the boat. This is so much more gentle, calm, right? Sort of the open vowels, sway, flow. There's no consonants that sort of stop them, halt them, in the same way you had with throbbing, shatters, prison. These are sort of far more airy vowels. And yet, we're reminded again of what fate actually holds for this boat. Fate holds that man dancing, the sort of mountainous waves. That's what is in store for Hecuba. And so again, that sense of dramatic irony returns. To keep time with the dirge I must sing now. That this is a kind of rhythmic lament. Not just what Hecuba is saying now, but her fate is a kind of rhythmic lament. Her life, the portrayal of it, is a rhythmic, sadness. and a narration of it. And I think that's also important to recognize in the context of what comes next, which is that she must sing this dirge, but it's also Euripides who must tell the story of Hecuba. And that's the obligation that this play is imbued with. Notice also here, I think, how jarringly disconnected these images are. One follows the other, but the animal sacrifice bears very little resemblance to the temple's throbbing, bears little resemblance to the walled prison of my breast, bears very little resemblance to this boat, bears little resemblance to what's coming next, which is the sort of threnody of tears, the black-clad muse. And in that sort of fractured sequence of images, you get a sense of the fractured mental state of Hecuba as well. And I think that's a sort of nice broader observation about this section of the text. This is the only theme for the black-clad muse of the destroyed. Notice how violent those consonants are, black-clad muse. But also how ominous of an image that is, the muse as this sort of source of art and beauty and literature in the ancient world. These sort of gentle things, these civil things, is sort of destroyed, made black-clad, as if going to some funeral. And there's a real sadness there, but also, if you look for it, I think there's hope there. That maybe out of all of this, there can emerge a black-clad muse of the form of Euripides, most literally, but also the possibility of art emerging, right? Many great poets hence will take us as their theme, Hecuba says later on. And that's, I guess, the hope in that phrase too. So, of the destroyed, no dancing can express it, dissonant music, harsh rhyme. This is so important in my mind, because it explains why this play is so unlike conventional theatre. It doesn't speak in sort of perfect verse. It doesn't speak in perfect words. Instead, it's a sequence of cries, screeches, screams, of agony and pain, because no dancing is fit to express it. Later on, she talks about how her song has become a scream. No music that I can borrow from stately dance or solemn psalming can be commensurate to the pain that she experiences. And that's why you need that dissonant music, that harsh rhyme. That's what those screams that echo on the banks of the Scamander, as Poseidon says, are. They are that attempt to express pain and to carry it across. Also, the asyndeton in the middle of that dissonant music, harsh rhyme, these really disjointed images. It's this kind of meta-theatrical comment, if you like. O you ships, whose sharp prows cut the purple sea as your oars pull in a cloud of spray. It's a disruption of fragility, that the Greek ships literally cut through this sort of serene water of the Mediterranean, right? And destroy it, disturb it in the same way that they destroy Troy. And there's a real sense of, therefore, sadness, I think, within that. It's a destruction of a sanctuary, as Hecuba describes it. Of the harbours of Greece till your bows, grounded in the bay of Troy, sad Troy, and then just 5 lines later, Troy, sad Troy. This is a kind of epithet, the descriptor that goes around with it constantly. And notice that sad is sort of placed between these two mentions of Troy. This is what lies at the core of Troy now. Troy has changed. It's not the kingdom that she used to rule over. That Troy is gone, right? And nothing of it remains. Instead, it is this enduring tale of sadness that Euripides is now narrating. Ominous, your flute's bleak song, your pipe's death-like cry. Music, and a critic, I think we will get there, but a critic makes a lot of comments on the musical imagery that is in here. That music, this thing that is very sacred to the Greeks, we assume very sacred to the Trojans, is destroyed, corrupted by this cause of war. And there's a real sadness there, I suppose. The flute, this delicate instrument, right, is capable of beautiful music is instead conscripted into this bleak song, into these death-like cries. There's a sense of disconnect there. It's almost oxymoronic, not quite, but I think you sense how deeply depraved humanity has become within that image. Like hunters on a scent of Menelaus's Helen, born to dismay her brother Castor. You get a real sense of vulnerability in Helen there. She is the prey to Menelaus on a scent. And that imagery of hunting when it comes to women occurs again and again. We've already had it once with Poseidon saying they can't wait to set eyes on their women and children again, right? And I mean, it'll occur again when they're talking about distributing these women, and when we're talking about Agamemnon sort of choosing Cassandra out of the lot. But I think remember that there's behind Helen, whether you choose to indict her or not, which is a question for your own decision, there is an underlying sense of vulnerability that, whether Hecuba is conscious of it or not, exists. Born to dismay her brother Castor and bring shame to the banks of Eurotas. Born to dismay suggests that she has no choice over it, that this is what fate has in store. And think then very hard about what that does for culpability. Is she culpable for the crime that she's accused of? And I would propose, and we'll talk about this later on, the answer is perhaps no, that she has no agency in that consideration. Her brother Castor, that even this context of harm, of shame, is imagined in terms of men. She's not just daughter of Tyndareus, she's sister of Castor, right? Another sort of definition of her with respect to a male figure. And I think it's a comment there on the agency of women. Bring shame to the banks of Eurotas. You brought death to Priam, whose seed bred 50 sons, a headlong fall to suffering Hecuba and a broken heart. Suffering Hecuba may as well be an epithet in this play. Is again her defining feature: enduring, suffering. That's what Hecuba as a character does in this play. But also a headlong fall, a sense of real, unprotectedness in that adjective. And then finally, you get this image that is allowed to finish off that stanza of this lament, a broken heart. And Taylor lets that sit there. Euripides' word order is actually slightly different in the Greek script, but Taylor chooses to finish on this image of the broken heart, literally sitting there shattered, right? The shattered, walled prison of her breast, and there's something quite confronting about that, viscerally sad, and I think it's quite powerful to leave it there as the final words of that stanza. Look at me now, throned in dust by Agamemnon's tent flap. Look at me now parallels something that Poseidon says earlier that you might have picked up on. Look at it now is what he says about Troy. But here, the it becomes Hecuba. And again, this then draws back to why that comment from Poseidon was so inhuman. Because suddenly these people, the things that encapsulate Troy, the human side of it, are reduced to an it, reduced to a kind of object that he cares for only as much as it benefits him. Then throned in dust, the cruel irony of lost power, right? She was literally throned, but now only in dust, a kind of mockery, if you like, of her old royal status. An old woman, grey-headed, attempt to build pathos, I think, right? Empathy, our sympathy for this woman, pity, if you like. Although many critics contend that it's not pity that she seeks. Dragged as a slave from my home, all hope plundered from my god-cursed, ravaged grey head. Think about how violent those verbs are. Plundered, ravaged. You can pair them up, I think, with the sort of shatters, burst, throbbing. There's a real sense of destruction, even in the internal monologue, even in what Hecuba as a single character is thinking here. Throned in dust, dragged as a slave from my home. Slave is given the final word in that line. And there's a real emphasis there. That's what she is reduced to, from a queen to a slave, in moments of Troy's fall. All hope plundered, that absolution, um, the unjust robbery of it, implied in plundered. Um, I think it's very, very important as you read this text to think about what Euripides thinks is just and what he thinks is unjust, and to draw out language features that allow you to analyze that. Because the majority of essay topics on this text in some way deal with the question of justice, even if it doesn't ask about it directly. And so finding moments, word choices, connotations that you think allow you to make an inference about Euripides' values judgment on what actions are just and unjust, I think is particularly important. I think plundered, ravaged are excellent words for that, because it's a sense of unjust deprivation, of unjust robbery, and absolution there as well. All hope is sort of the enjambment, right? We get this image of all hope, and then bam, plundered. My God cursed, ravaged grey head. Cool. With no reprieve, it's literally no reprieve. Again, it's sort of true narrativistically, but also true outside of the narrative, right? She is offered no reprieve. It's an episodic text. And so after one episode after the other, Hecuba's dragged from scene to scene, from interaction to interaction, and she just has to cope with that. Right. No reprieve from my punishment of everlasting sorrow. Weep, wives of bronze-armored Trojans. One, I think you get the sense here of Hecuba's a very conventional, well, as a holder of a very conventional view of womanhood. As much as, we are sympathetic to Hecuba as a woman, I think here you get a sense of a real abidance by convention. And you see that again, I think, far more grotesquely, actually, in the Helen episode. But just here, there's a pride there. Wives of bronze-armored Trojans. She's proud to be that. But also in bronze-armored Trojans, a sense of Homeric glory. By Homeric, I mean the sort of glory enshrined in the Iliad, as the making of Greek heroes, kleos, right? That central concept of where does glory come from? Well, it comes from the battlefield. It is a belief of the Greeks. It's an idea that Euripides tries to take down. But that sort of image of a man dressed in sort of glistening bronze is so powerful here. Grieve for your heroes dead, daughters, harrow. The chiasmic arrangements of imperatives. Grieve for your heroes dead, daughters, harrow. Verb, noun, noun, verb. Particularly powerful, I think. Emphasis is added through that. But also your heroes. Again, the sort of sense of family unit being the defining feature of these women. The clouds with your tears for husbands lost. Grief is not for themselves. Hecuba, whether this is a general comment about the women or just about herself, we don't know, I suppose. But at least Hecuba seems to never curse her fate, and never loses hope abjectly, and never grieves for herself. And this is what I've tried to get at with our introduction to Hecuba, is that we know the least about Hecuba because she doesn't talk about her own suffering to any great extent. Rather, she's sort of this facilitator, this supporter of the others. And so grief is not reserved for herself. Grief is reserved for her husband, Priam. And there's a real sadness there, an inability to sort of express herself. And we eventually get it back. This is the thing that we notice throughout the play, is Hecuba is engaged in a form of expression, even if it's not of self. There's still something, I wouldn't venture inherently, but at least in abstraction, powerful about that. Cool. Troy is burning. I find that present continuous particularly powerful. It's a very short line. I think you can actually comment on that. It adds emphasis to that line. But also, that short declarative, Troy is burning, the present continuous verb, suffering continues, the metaphorical burning continues, even if literally it's merely smoking at this stage. That the human Troy is burning. Later on, you have Hecuba describe Cassandra. Well, she's not describing Cassandra, but I take it to describe Cassandra. She talks about this sort of beautiful flame flowers, right, and a sort of beautiful kind of burning. And that's in many ways what this suffering is. This suffering creates a piece of art, the Women of Troy, the play that you're studying. And so there's something quite powerful about that continued burning as well, that the ashes of Troy aren't entirely extinguished. Like a mother bird at her plundered nest, again, sense of injustice heightens. My song has become a scream, no music I can borrow from stately dance or solemn psalming. My song has become a scream, again, harsh music, dissonant rhyme, all the same analysis applies there. But I borrow voice, expression in this state, in this country, in this era, is borrowed. It's not hers. She doesn't have ownership over it. And there's a real tragedy there. In a story that's ostensibly about Hecuba, she doesn't have the voice to speak, or at least she's not offered voice to speak. Instead, it's borrowed from stately dance, from solemn psalming, these sort of manifestations of institution, right? And later we get this exact same image of Priam's scepter in my hand. Whether or not that's a phallic image, I mean, we can debate till the cows come home. But even outside of that, I think this sense of borrowed power, it's Priam's scepter, not her own. And so this is perhaps why sort of she values marriage so much, right? It's perhaps why Andromache values her marriage so much. The highest that a woman can aspire to is to marry Hector. I think in there you find both something quite tragic. I think that they can't have full agency over themselves. That this kind of power has to be borrowed, or else it's non-existent. Right. So that's the end of the line-by-line analysis of this monody. What I want to do now is to consider what our impression of Hecuba is after this monody. So, to me, this opening monologue captures the key features of Hecuba in this text as a mother deprived entirely of individuality before the merciless gods. There's a simultaneous awareness of her own state and an obliviousness to Troy's flaws that we later see in the Helen episode, but also just an absolute degradation of her as a person. Lushnig, a Italian critic, notes this. He says, the great queen lies on the ground, a symbol of her degradation. The hopes of Troy, small as though they were, are also smashed to the ground in the murder of Astyanax. And here he's making a comment on the staging of this play, actually. He describes the sort of use of levels of the stage symbolically, that Hecuba literally sort of starts on the ground, fallen. Then slowly across the play stands up, rises, goes from one episode to the other, and then finishes the play again on that ground, saying old limbs strengthen, trying to get up again, right? And I think there's a grain of truth in there, that in this play, I guess, the sort of literal elevation of people is a chart for the sort of strength of humanity as we go on. Here, she demands our empathy and compassion, I think, our love and pity as she openly confronts the magnitude of this loss. And she does so in a way that is, in some sense, admirable. Glenn Most, in 2012, describes the play itself as a sort of tableau of suffering that doesn't have a tightly lit storyline. And Hecuba, as a character, doesn't have a tightly knit storyline. For a main character, there's not progression in this play as such, right? Like, she doesn't seem to learn anything, but instead it's an exhibition. It's a showing of how horrific her life has become. And given that all the men have been slain by the Greek victors, it is their women, mothers, daughters, wives, who can now alone give voice to the suffering of this city. That is the must. I think that's the imperative that Euripides tries to enshrine that we were talking about before. That's why it must be expressed, because they are the only ones that can do so. And it's an obligation to exhibit, to show, to frame, and to never forget that kind of suffering. Then later in this passage, Most says, in contrast to the tragedy Hecuba, another one of Euripides' tragedies, here the woman who ruled Troy with her defeated Greek women and children are deprived not only of the act, but even of the bare hope of vengeance. And I think that's important, that the reality of Hecuba is known to us, but is not known to Hecuba herself. And it's perhaps the point at which narrative, or rather dramatic irony, is the most important in this play. Because Hecuba is the one character that continues to assert hope. Cassandra does so, but she doesn't do so naively. She's a prophetess. She can see into the future. Hecuba can't. And then so many times that Hecuba says things like, but in life there is still hope, become these sort of tragic statements because we know that there is no hope for her. And yet she continues to assert it nevertheless. And if you want to quantify the ultimate tragedy of Hecuba, I think it must be that she suffers hoping that there is something over the horizon, but the horizon sort of never arrives for her. And I think Moss is right. In Hecuba, we find a sense of abject powerlessness, narrativistically. She's doomed in the most literal sense, and for her, we are asked to feel a sense of pity. But also, meta-narrativistically, there's something brave and powerful about Hecuba in light of that. By meta-narrativistically, what I mean there is knowing that it is the case that she has no hope, that no hope should be available to her. The fact that she still feels hope, even in the sort of destitution, abject destitution that she's placed in, there's something still quite powerful about that. It's a statement on the human spirit and how strong it is. And I think that's what Kinney captures quite well here. First, he describes the play. The play is structured by a series of encounters with Hecuba, whose slow recognition of the full measure of war comments on the enormity of its effects, and so fixes Euripides' indictment. And sure, I think that's true. I think that sort of captures the magnitude of the suffering that she undergoes. But it's the response to suffering that I think is particularly important in the way that Kinney describes it. But Euripides attends to Hecuba's mind, to her ability to hold firm despite the unpredictable world of flux and circumstance in which she continues to find herself. A flux and circumstance is the sort of repeated batterings of fate, reminders that she lives in a world that she cannot control, governed by forces that she has no agency over. Thus, her heroism is grounded in her willing acquiescence, as opposed to Helen's pride, her resilient hope as opposed to Andromache's hopelessness, and her insistence on opportunities quite possibly available in some unknown future, as opposed to Cassandra's much more limited desire to destroy the old order. I think that's incredibly powerful, and it's an articulation of why Hecuba as a figure is sort of worthy of praise, not just pity. And she's worthy of praise because even in these most dire of circumstances, she insists on hope. Is it naive? Yes, it's a naive hope, sure. Is it, unbelievable? Is it false hope? Yes, of course it is. But the human capacity for hope, the human capacity for wonder, and for an imagining of the future that's better than her current circumstance is nevertheless moving. She rises, she lifts herself, not in defeat, but in tragic submission, still subservient to no one but herself. Without dismissing her loneliness, without dismissing her loss, Euripides traces in Hecuba a source not only of woe, but also of wonder. In discovering in her the elemental strength of the human spirit, he's able to accommodate even the outrageous act of human will which obliterated Troy. And quite beautifully, I think, Kinney there summarizes what's powerful about Hecuba. And I think that's what we begin to see this monologue, but obviously, necessarily plays out as the play plays out. And I think this is a lovely point to end on, because it's certainly not one of hope. It's not a hopeful play. But it's one worthy of praise, that in this darkness, in this sort of cave darkness, right, complete darkness, Vanta Black, you get these flashes of hope, these brief moments of unsullied humanity, and I think you see some of them in this monologue, and it begins to define Hecuba as a character. So as we return to Hecuba, never sort of as an individual anymore, but in her dialogues with other people, I think remember that remember the power that we can find in Hecuba's monologue and in her presence merely on stage, having endured so much and continuing to endure the horrors that she faces. All right, hopefully that was helpful. I'll see you next time.